My name is Esther Bigler, and I direct the Labor and Employment Law program at the Cornell ILR School. This is a CLE program. Soon after you check into this program, in the chat box, you will see the URL for our materials, and you will also see the URL for our evaluation. Both are very important to me that you have access to them. Sometime during the program, I will announce the CLE code. That is the code that you will add to the evaluation form. Please, even if you're not interested in the CLEs, please fill out the evaluation form. The chat box will also be the place for you to ask your questions. If you have a question for a specific presenter, please indicate that in the chat box. After the presentations, I will be asking a few questions of the presenters, and then at that point, I will turn to the questions you have asked in the chat box. When you see the URL in the chat box, I suggest that you paste them into an email so that you have them. The program will end at approximately 3:15. So why this program? States in the Northeast are opening up. Other states are already open, and we see a resurgence of COVID-19 in some of those states. New York City is now in phase 2, which means offices can reopen and so can retail, among other businesses. We have a national audience today, and your state or city may be in a different place, but the question is the same. How do we reopen and how do we stay open, meeting the needs of employees to be safe and for employers to do their best while taking into account the Americans with Disabilities Act? Employers and landlords will be screening employees and asking about their health in ways we never imagined a year ago. Frankly, the responsibility is on employers and businesses of all sizes and in all industries. Our goal today is to provide some training on these very complex issues. Our speakers today are Wendy Strobel-Gower, who is the project director at the Yang Tang Institute at ILR. She leads the Northeast ADA Center, the Diversity Partners Project, and fee-for-service work to educate managers and supervisors about including people with disabilities. She has worked extensively in the application and training of issues around employment and reasonable accommodation at the workplace. Other areas of interest are disability legislation and the identification and accommodation of functional limitations of people with disabilities across their lifespan. Eve Klein is a partner and chair of the Duane Morris Employment, Labor, Benefits, and Immigration Practice Group. She also serves as the firm's employment counsel. Ms. Klein has over 30 years of experience representing businesses in all aspects of employment regulation. She advises and defends employers in connection with issues and claims involving the full range of employment laws, including employment discrimination statutes, disability accommodation obligations, both employment and public accommodation, family and medical leave, etc. Mark Weiss joined Cushman & Wakefield as an executive vice chairman in January 2016, having established himself as a leading commercial broker, advisor, tactician within the real estate industry in New York City. His range of experience and expertise includes successfully completing some of the city's most noteworthy and complex transactions in leasing, sales, and development. With 32 years of experience in commercial real estate, Mr. Weiss has completed more than 1,400 transactions, comprising a broad range of sizes, scope, and innovation. Full bios of our panelists are on our Labor and Employment Law website, as well as all of our materials. I would like to start with Eve and asking her to respond to the following question. Eve, please discuss the interplay of the issues of workplace safety and the ADA as businesses open up and welcome employees back to work after several months of being home. Eve, you are muted.
Thanks, Esther. Okay, I'm going to get into my presentation and with that answer Esther's question. Let me put that on full screen mode. Is that on full screen mode?
We don't have the PowerPoint yet, no.
Shall I put it up?
Yep.
Yeah, you'll need to go into Zoom and then select it, share screen at the bottom of the Zoom screen.
Where is that? I'm sorry, it's not showing up here.
Yeah, sure. If you're in the PowerPoint full screen mode, you can exit that. Just press escape.
I'm not in the full screen mode.
Okay, are you in Zoom?
Yeah, had it open as we did last time.
Yes,
Right.
so just go to the bottom, click on share screen,
Okay,
and then select the thumbnail for your, there you
great.
go. And then
There we go.
presentation mode.
And where is that?
Slideshow up at the top, menu bar. Over to the right.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thanks everybody.
One last thing. We need to swap the displays. So up at the top, it says swap displays.
Where is that?
I don't see your PowerPoint.
There
we
it
go.
is.
We're good now.
We're good.
Is it good now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, here we go, everybody. Thank you. All right, so as we're all getting ready to reopen in the New York area, other places in the country, we're hearing as of this morning, possibly Texas might not be reopening and is moving backwards in time. So we have a lot of different things going, but one thing that is clear is that whatever stage of reopening or operations companies are in, there are a whole multitude of regulations that they have to follow and should follow. So we've got governor's executive orders. We have some states that are actually legislating what is required for COVID-19. We have counties that have different regulations that sometimes are more restrictive and supplement the state regulations. And then in addition to that, we have OSHA guidelines and CDC guidelines, all of which are really important for employers to implement, both to keep their employees and their workplaces safe and also to ensure that if there were any claims brought, that they'd have a very strong defense. So I'm going to just lay out what those plans look like and then really get into the focus of my discussion today, which is on reasonable accommodations, which comes up as we work through these plans. So what do you do to implement a plan? The start is to look at what the state requires and then what the county requires. And oftentimes there are specific requirements, and then oftentimes they are supplemented by recommendations. In New York, we just moved into phase 2 this week, which has allowed offices to reopen, and Governor Cuomo has posted for offices reopening mandatory and then recommended guidelines. But as I mentioned, that should be supplemented with what the CDC and what OSHA has to say. In other jurisdictions, in California in particular, we're dealing not only with state regulations, but county by county supplementing those. And those regulations, while similar in that they generally require engineering controls to be put in place, such as the employer can actually have distance between desks, they can have barriers and things of that nature in place that they might not have had before, and input administrative controls such as staggering the workforce coming in, staggering hours so that there are less people perhaps using shared spaces like elevators, and then distributing PPE. All of those are components of what's required, but some states actually require more than others. These plans not only should be on paper, but they need to be posted, they need to be communicated, and importantly, like any other employment policy that you have, like, for example, a workplace harassment policy, you need to train employees on the policy, because if you don't train employees, they're not going to follow it. If you don't train employees, they're not going to know that you're serious about these policies. And like any other policies, then you need to enforce them. So what about screening? That's what I want to start with. Some states are mandating screening. New York requires some type of screening. It doesn't specify. In California, for example, in San Diego, the county, any office in the county is required to not only screen for temperature, but to have the employers actually do it themselves, not rely on an employee that might be doing it at home. So I want to talk a little bit about screening processes because it's really an important component of what all employers have to do in reopening and in keeping employees safe. First thing is they must be conducted in a non-discriminatory, safe, and compliant manner. What does that mean? Employers should not pick certain employees to screen and not others, thinking, okay, maybe one minority group is more likely to be to have COVID-19 or be exposed to it than any other group. That is absolutely unlawful, and employees should be screened across the board. It should be done safely and in a manner that's legally compliant. For example, if you're doing a temperature screening, you want to have some privacy associated with that. You don't want to announce results to where a lot of people can hear it. You should be thoughtful about the process. A lot of employers wonder, can we do this? Because generally we know that medical inquiries are prohibited by the EEOC unless there is a clear business purpose. It has to be business related and consistent with job necessity. And because COVID-19 has been deemed a widespread disease across the country, and it is in a community spread situation, the EEOC has posted guidance about 6 weeks ago that specifically says that employers may screen, and actually there's no problem screening. The only thing that employers need to keep in mind, though, is there has to be reasonable accommodations where necessary. I'm going to talk a little bit about that during this presentation. But yes, you should screen. Yes, it's required by certain jurisdictions, and it's certainly prudent. OSHA requires that employers keep employees safe, and it doesn't specifically mandate how you do that. But certainly OSHA will look to whether the employer is following state requirements, local requirements, and best practices as put out by the CDC. And screening is important because if somebody has COVID-19 or has symptoms and is likely to have it or has been exposed recently, we know, but all of us know from reading and hearing everything on a daily basis about this disease, it spreads very quickly from person to person. So those individuals need to be kept out of the workplace. So what are the inquiries that are permissible, and how can we do that? It can be several different ways, and I'm seeing employers be creative in doing it in different ways. Some employers have a form where they actually go through a series of questions that they ask employees to fill out. Others are screening them orally and taking notes and keeping records that they've done that. And yet others, particularly those in bigger workplaces, are using an app where employees can input that information, and either the employer keeps it or a third party that's developed the app may be keeping that. And any of those things would be compliant. The inquiries, though, have to be limited to whether the employees have symptoms of COVID-19. What are those symptoms? That's a good question because those symptoms change as we learn more and they're updated, and employers should always be looking at what's current. But currently, we're talking about fevers, chills, coughs, shortness of breath, a sore throat, an inability to smell or taste, gastro problems, and the like. Those are the types of questions that should be asked. But really, you need to limit those inquiries to those related to COVID-19. So what about the paternalistic employer? I am getting a lot of questions. Just this week, I had an employer with absolutely the best of intentions say to me, Eve, look, I know that I've got an employee in the workplace that's been struggling. She has cancer. She's been going for treatment for chemotherapy. And I know that she's in a high risk group just from reading about this, that, she's got, immune issues. I also have some older workers. I have a worker that's been on dialysis. Can I do the right thing here? And can I just tell them that they must continue to work from home indefinitely until we have a grip on this disease? And the answer, surprisingly, is no. And the EEOC says no. If an employee requests a reasonable accommodation, then all of those things are certainly on the table, and the employer should go ahead and ask information and get medical support if there's a question about it, to make it a reasonable accommodation, which certainly could have the employee continue to work from home. But if the employee has not raised that issue, to single the employee out is something that is discriminatory. Now, you might ask, okay, well, I'm just going to raise it with the employee. I'm not going to actually force them to do it if they don't want to. But that, creates a taint. When an employer shows an employee that they're thinking about something, even if with the best intentions, something later happens in the workplace. You know, as an employment lawyer and litigator, I see that an employee often will think, well, gee, you know, I was laid off, I was terminated, and 2 weeks ago the employer mentioned my disability. That must be a motivating factor behind the thing. So the employer has risk if they do that and makes an employee feel uncomfortable. An exception to that is some state and local laws in New York and California. Locally, we're required to offer an accommodation and perhaps even raise that subject where the disability is known, but only where it's really required. So I would distinguish between a disability, like I mentioned, where somebody who is maybe on dialysis or chemotherapy, let them raise that issue. Whereas if somebody, for example, is in a wheelchair and because of changes you're making to the workplace, then they're not going to be able to move around. That would be something that you'd need to raise, a little bit of a different scenario. So when can you, is there any circumstance when you can limit the employee from coming in because you know they have a disability? It really is very narrow. You have to be able to show that they pose a direct risk to themselves or to others. A direct risk to self is something where having them in poses a significant harm to them. It's a high standard, and the law requires an individualized assessment. And employers, while good meaning, are not doctors. And everybody's medical condition, whether it's cancer or some type of immunosuppressed situation, is different. And what might be harmful for one may not be for someone else. So it's really up to a medical expert to provide that information, and that's why an employer shouldn't go ahead and make an assumption. And then there's the balancing test, and then even then, the employer has to provide a reasonable accommodation before making that requirement that an employee not come into the workplace. So there's going to be a lot of litigation on this subject, and employees have rights to be treated fairly. So it's a real balance here, and if these issues come up, please review them with your counsel before going forward. Another question that I wanted to put out there is, what about family members? We have a lot of employees that live with older people that might be caring for elderly parents or grandparents, and you know they're being appropriate because younger people we know might be asymptomatic and then bring COVID-19 to somebody who's older, who's at a higher risk group, and they may coming into the employer and saying, look, can I have an accommodation? Can I work from home? Does the employer have to do that? And the answer is the employer does not have to do that. Maybe the employer should do that and could, if they can, do that, but they do not have to do that. And so there's a distinction between the accommodation requirements for an employee and for those that they live with. How do we handle the temperature scans? Some best practices I wanted to put out there for you, which I bullet pointed and can also talk to folks offline afterwards. But we can go ahead and do those. The EEOC has said that temperature scans are appropriate, just like the questionnaires in this circumstance. It's best practice to have a signed waiver because you're going to be getting medical information from an employee, which must be protected by the ADA and local discrimination statutes. And if that information is coming from a third-party provider, there can be HIPAA requirements. So signed waiver is a good thing for that. You should designate somebody who can handle the screening, somebody who you've trained. Don't just hand it to an employee and say, go to it. Train them on how to do it. Make sure they have PPE. Not just a face mask, but if you can do a face shield on that, have them standing back with hopefully a thermometer that can work from a distance and they don't have to be right close to the employees, that would be a good thing. Ensure social distancing online. So if you have a bunch of employees in a plant or where they're coming in at the same time, first of all, try to stagger them so you don't have a long line. But if you do have a line, have places where they can designate where they can stand, where they're not on top of each other, and enforce that. Compensation, that issue comes up. Should employees be compensated? The best answer is yes, so you may have a dispute on that. If you've got unionized employees, you'll certainly have the union asking you to do that, and that can be a bargainable subject. When you get information, even though the EEOC is saying we can't get that information because it is pursuant to a job necessity and certainly related to business needs for operation in COVID-19, keep that information separate in a medical file with only access to people who has a real need for that information. New York State just will note has passed rules that say employers should not keep the temperature information once they take that. So what the best practice there that we're recommending is that you go with a pass-fail and don't actually keep the temperature information. Other things is be discreet in communicating the results of the temperature scan. Don't announce it in front of a lot of people. If you have an employee that says to you, look, you know, I don't think this is accurate. I took my temperature this morning, or I've got some other medical condition that or medication I'm taking that raises my temperature, and I know it's COVID-19, it's not COVID-19 related. Listen to your employees. You are required to accommodate them. And it's not a one-fit package. If somebody has something they can establish to you that requires you to modify your questionnaires or modify the temperature scans, you know, the results on them, make sure that you do that. Okay, how does an employee return if they have a positive temperature scan? You can keep them out for 72 hours, making sure that they're negative. They tell you that they're negative, and then you check them again, and that should be without taking any fever-reducing medication, or they can go out and get a COVID-19 test result that's negative. All of those would work. How about COVID-19 tests? What I'm talking about. Again, EEOC says job-related, consistent with business necessity. You can require those tests if you'd like to. You should pay for them and pay for the time associated with doing that. Question might come down to availability. In all jurisdictions, they're not readily available. And that information should likewise be kept in a separate medical file, and similar protocols to the temperature scans that I just spoke to when taking them, you know, in terms of keeping social distance and training people who are doing them, etc. How about antibody testing? Not yet. I think when I say not yet, I expect that to change. Everything is changing, but the EEOC has not endorsed this, most likely because the results are not yet accurate. There are a lot of different accuracy levels on these tests. And we also don't know that if having antibodies actually provides immunities. I think if we get positive answers to those questions, we'll likely see that change.
Eve, I'd like you to wrap up so that we can move to the next speaker, please.
Exactly right. So this slide talks about ADA accessibility issues, and I just note them on there for your reference. But Wendy, who's going to be following me and speaking, is actually the expert on all of these topics, and she's going to cover accessibility issues in connection with Title III of the ADA.
Thank you very much, Eve. That was so
kind. Folks, these are the takeaway items that you have as a summary, which is a good summary of things to do. Thanks, Esther.
Thank you so much. So Wendy, I'd like to turn to you. Could you please start our discussion of the unique issues facing workers who have disabilities, both disabilities which are visible and disabilities which are not? What kind of reasonable accommodation should these employees be given under the ADA? And what kind of safety issues are ones that you want to address that were mentioned by Eve? This is a unique group of people, and I think often we don't think about them when we think about people coming back to the workplace. So could you please educate us about this?
Sure, Esther, I'm glad to. So I think that it's really important to remember that all of the reasonable accommodation requirements that were in place before COVID-19 hit are still in place. The EEOC and the guidance they've released is recognizing that there is some leeway that's going to have to happen in getting medical documentation from providers who are overwhelmed with the pandemic, and maybe granting some accommodations on a time-limited basis until everything can be shored up with documentation. But the need to reasonably accommodate your workers doesn't change. I wanted to talk a little bit about returning to work and some of the issues that may raise for people with disabilities as well. So Eve was clear that barring individuals from the workplace solely because of a disability or other risk factor is not allowed. You can't tell all your employees with disabilities or all your older people that they should just stay home. So really the question becomes, how do we keep people safe and productive during the pandemic? What's the best way for us to do this, given their reasonable accommodation concerns, given the changes that we have to make in the work environment? And really that reasonable accommodation and the interactive dialogue that happens with that is going to be really critical to help employers ensure success. One of the things that I've been very concerned about as we think about going back There's a lot of plans to limit traffic flow and change the way we move about and use the workplace. So we're going to talk about traffic flow first. What I want you to remember, the most important thing is that plans to limit traffic flow must maintain access for people with disabilities. So if you're choosing one among many entrances, choose the accessible entrance. If you're choosing one among many paths of travel through your building, choose the one that's accessible. When you're barring access to elevators or limiting access to elevators, there are considerations that you have to take into account. For example, if you say only people who use mobility devices can use elevators, you run into the idea that a lot of people who don't have obvious disabilities also need that kind of assistance. So someone might have MS and they can't walk up 10 flights of stairs. That elevator is also going to have to be open to them. And again, if you're going to choose between which restrooms you're leaving open, make sure that the accessible restroom is on that list so that people who need it can access it. So really be prepared that whatever plan you make, you're going to have to make exceptions to that plan for people with disabilities. And train whoever is doing your monitoring and your screening that there are going to be exceptions. So the big one is Governor Cuomo got on TV and says, no mask, no entry. Well, except for when you can't wear a mask, right? So what are the alternatives that you're going to offer to people who can't wear a standard cloth face covering? Can you have face shields available? Can you say, if you can wrap a loose scarf around your face, we can live with that. But people need to know that it's not just a, if you don't have it, you're out kind of rule. So there's a few things I wanted to touch on in particular that could be issues for people with disabilities as we're preparing to go back to work, and some of the ways that we might change it. Visual indicators of path of travel are not going to be accessible to people who can't see. So you put lines 6 feet apart on the floor. Well, that's great, except for if you don't know they're there. And because of the level of sensitivity that people have amongst each other for violating that space, I think it's real important to make sure that people know they're there. So give tactile indicators of space. Can you have a tactile line spacing that has the truncated domes that you see in the curb cuts that indicate where the line is? Can you have an audio indicator? Can you have someone who helps someone maintain that distance if they are unable to look at those visual lines? If you're doing it in an office space where you're dictating the flow of traffic directionally, is there motion or voice activated technology options such as Alexa that can be used to provide auditory information? You're supposed to be going forward here, or you can't enter this area, so that people who are blind or have visual processing issues will know where to go. Again, remember that reduced access to restrooms is not only a matter of physical access, so for people with physical disabilities, but many disabilities cause complications that impact bowel or bladder control. So we have one restroom open, it's at the far end of the hall, and because of the way we've restricted traffic, it's going to take you 15 minutes to get there. It's not always going to be something that works for people. And in those cases, you will have to make exceptions. You could open a restroom only to them. You could open a restroom only to a certain area, but those are considerations you're going to have to make. I want to talk a little bit about face coverings, and just, another reminder that some people can't wear masks. So make sure you're offering alternatives. A face shield may work, a private office space, so that they can limit the time spent in a face covering. A lot of people are proposing repurposed conference rooms. Can you enable expedited entry when wearing a mask is difficult for someone because of breathing issues? And how are you going to facilitate that? Also recognize that when people are wearing cloth face masks, people who have hearing impairments or are deaf, who read lips or rely on facial expression as part of their understanding communication, will not be able to use those methods. So recommending technologies such as LiveScribe, or it's not LiveScribe, it is Transcribe Live, I believe, that they can use to help understand. Having technology available, such as a UB Duo or a computer terminal, where people can type to each other, as opposed to having verbal communication back and forth when they would have to take off that face covering. Those are all options that you could use. Return to work considerations going on. For some people who have chemical sensitivity, the constant cleaning and disinfecting that has to happen, they're saying 3 times a day, with a cleaner that is approved on that CDC list that's available, or the OSHA list. Those are strong chemicals and they will smell. So some people who have chemical sensitivity issues will not be able to be in the workplace when those chemicals are being used. And so you will have to accommodate people. So that's kind of a big deal. And the other thing is that there are people who you can say, I'm going to limit touch, but if you're blind and you need to read Braille, you're going to have to touch that Braille signage, right? So think about options for that. And if you're propelling a manual wheelchair, you have a lot higher contact level between your hands and surface. So can you offer a heavy duty glove to them so that while they're moving around, they could use that, and then have more available so they can take them off when they get to their workstation. We talked a little bit about the closure restriction of elevators already, but just remember that it's not just people who use a mobility device who need wheelchairs or who need elevators. So you got to think about how you're going to do that. And then there's always the issue of someone who needs a companion to come with them. It might be a job coach for someone with an intellectual disability. It might be an aide for someone who has a physical disabilities. But in times when access is severely restricted, you're going to have to think through a plan for someone who needs to bring an extra person with them into the workplace. So that's another big consideration for us. Oops, I skipped one. I wanted to talk a little bit too about the public places that offer services to the public, right, as they reopen. It's really important to remember that all the rules around Title III to modify your policy and practice, to not exclude people with disabilities, those still apply. So we have to think about how are we going to do that. Providing accessible curbside services is critical. So you can't require someone to be in a car. Many people with disabilities don't drive. So how are you going to offer services to them that is still accessible and still protect safety? So really, it's important to define what is acceptable face coverings for a customer situation and have a contingency plan. If someone can't wear a face mask and you have a small store, can you instead offer them curbside service? Can you offer them home delivery? And how are you going to communicate that? The importance of accessible websites cannot be underestimated here, because if people can't read your website, they cannot get your information about how you're planning to reopen. And just again, be prepared to make exceptions to your policies and practices. I am not an expert on the physical access rules. I have an expert on my team, but I am not that person. So I'm giving you the contact information for that, for my agency that you can call and get those answers. So I think that is it for me, Esta.
Thank you, Wendy. Very, very helpful. And now I'd like to turn to Mark. Mark, we've talked about what happens when I get, or any person gets, to the employer's space, to the employer's floor. But that is not going to be the first place the returning employee will be greeted. That's going to be the building's lobby. What will landlords be doing to make a safe return possible for tenants and their employees? What emerging issues do you see for building staff taking temperatures, assigning elevators, really being sort of the first place where people are coming back to work for many people who work in an office building?
So Esther, there's a lot there. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm a commercial real estate broker, and I actually represent a lot of educational institutions, but I also represent a lot of law firms. And I live and breathe inside these office buildings. And the landlords in New York City pretty much only do the right thing when they have no other choice. And the reason I say that is there's different types of landlords. There's no set list of rules they have to play by. And so they sort of go along as best they can or as they see fit. So there's a lot that's going to change, that needs to change, and all of those changes cost money. In one of our pre-calls, I spoke about the managing partner of a law firm who's also a litigator running late from Grand Central to his office. It's a hot day, he's carrying a litigation bag and he's wearing a mask. And by the time he gets to the lobby of the building, he's overheated. And then he goes for his temperature scan and he's told he can't go upstairs. He's got a room full of people waiting for him and he can't go there. Well, he's going to explode, and who's he going to explode at? Well, that means the landlord's going to have to staff that lobby, not just with equipment, but with professionals who are trained at de-escalation. That's expensive. Well, that's just a necessary cost of running an office building, especially in the day and age of COVID. So I wanted to develop a sensitivity for everybody on this call as to what the basic costs are as it relates to an office building. So I'm sharing my screen right now. I'm assuming everyone can see that. Is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay, so there's 4 components of rent, and I just picked an arbitrary number at the top of $60 a foot, meaning what goes into rent. Well, the first thing that goes into rent is the operating expenses of the building. It's the pass-through. You give it to the landlord, but he's using it to run his building. The second is real estate taxes. You're giving that to the landlord, but he's using that, he's paying that to the city. So for the first $26 a foot of income within your rent, it's a pass-through. Then the landlord has debt service, meaning they all have a loan. And let's say it's acquisition, development, improvement, financed very inexpensively. It's always the most, most expensive part of any capital structure in any office building. So for $800 a foot at 3.2% interest rate, his annual debt service is $24.38 a foot. So this landlord has costs of $50 a foot, but he's got a rent of $60 a foot. So he's got $10 a foot of profit. Now, if you'll notice, I highlighted in red the operating expenses and the real estate expense number because they're both going to go up. But the rent's not going up because the rent's part of a long-term contract. In fact, the rents landlords are receiving are going to go down through 2 factors. 1, the market's softening, but 2, the default rate amongst tenants is quite high, and it's going to get higher once the PPP money goes away. So this landlord in this example was making $10 a foot. Chances are his operating expenses are going to go up by $2 a foot, and his real estate taxes are going to go up by $3 a foot. So very quickly, that landlord's going to find that he's only got $5 a foot of surplus within his rent. Now, on the, excuse me, I'm going to click to the next slide.
You can use the arrows at the top by the 1 and 3, if you'd like.
That's awful.
At the top of the screen, you'll see an arrow pointing up and an arrow pointing down. Oh, there you go.
So here's a depiction, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but the New York City real estate market was in trouble before COVID. When I say in trouble, the market's 430 million square feet of space. The market in the entire city of Denver, which everyone's seen from airplane windows, is much smaller. It's 30 million square feet of space. We're adding inventory in excess of that, or we've just added through Hudson Yards and World Trade Center. So think about this. COVID's hitting New York City buildings just as new, expensive, beautiful buildings have filled up and have decanted the 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old buildings. There's a demand-supply imbalance, so rents were falling through the older product because everyone went to the new, shiny product. So the $60 a foot a landlord may have thought he was going to get, that landlord is going to find themselves getting less anyway, with an increased default rate, with increased operating costs, and with increased real estate taxes. So when you layer those things together, the profitability has gone away. And in fact, many buildings are going to be running in the negative. Once a building's running in a negative, a landlord doesn't feel like he owns it, and services will fall. So now we spoke about services. Regular office services, someone to greet you in the lobby, doesn't include temperature screening, doesn't include extra cleaning, doesn't include the sort of staffing that you're going to need 24/7 to get this done professionally, doesn't include the costs of enhanced air filtration or accommodations for anyone getting into the building as they have to wait for a very long line to get into a building. If a landlord's losing money, it's very unlikely that that landlord is going to be able to or willing to split that extra money into their building. So, we look at the real estate market in terms of what's its health. And this is a very important slide for everybody to take in, because in the context of landlords should do, landlords should do, landlords should do, landlords may not be able to do it or may not be willing to do it. And as this pandemic unfolds and works its evil magic, we think there'll be a lot of debtors in possession that will have to do these things. And foreclosing banks are absolutely not in a position, based on their experience and makeup, to do the human intensive interactions that are necessary to make a building run effectively and in a healthful way. So in this slide, we track the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is the black line, and we look at absorption, how much net space is added to a market or subtracted from a market. And you'll see that real estate is a trailing indicator. If everyone goes back to 2001, the stock market took a dive, and it was a full 9 months later till the real estate market, through negative absorption, corrected. The real estate market didn't increase up until 9 months after the stock market increased. The most telling thing is in 2008, when the stock market took a dive, it didn't really dent the absorption numbers until 2009, when the bottom fell out. The real estate market rebounded only 9 months after the stock market came back. Now we're faced with a triple witching hour. The stock market has taken a bit of a beating. There has been a correction in the economy. There was a black swan event with COVID. At the same time, there's a massive amount of overbuilding. At the same time, we have massive confusion from Washington as to what we should be doing. And all those things are recipes for a compressing real estate market. A compressing real estate market, prices going down, landlords being foreclosed upon. At the same time, there's a greater need for skilled management, caring management, sensitive management, expensive management, is a recipe for stress. So I think my role in all of this is to listen, learn, and acknowledge that a lot of things need to be done, must be done, but they're all going to be expensive, and there may not be a reservoir of money available to get that done.
Thank you, Mark. That's very sobering.
It's a sobering reality. And, I lead a team of 18 people, and we had a meeting in February, and, I said, this economy is incredibly robust and things are good. I wonder when it's going to end. So let's keep working hard, because when it ends, it's probably going to end violently. Never in a million years did I think it was going to end and stop quite as violently as it stopped.
I don't think any of us anticipated this. That's for sure. So, but this is where we are. And so I'd like to turn to Wendy because I have another question for Wendy. And after Wendy speaks, I think Eve, you might want to jump in here as well. So Wendy, this is something I've been thinking about. Do you think that people who have not disclosed that they have a disability or have an underlying medical condition that's been listed by the CDC as making them more serious if they should get COVID, they've not come forward to the employer at all. Do you think that now people with asthma, someone with perhaps who is diabetic or a liver disease or some other autoimmune problem perhaps, will now ask an accommodation from an employer when they've not done so previously and they may have had this condition for 5 years, 10 years? What do you think?
Oh, I'm sorry, Asta. The short answer is yes. So whenever someone's deciding whether or not to disclose a disability, usually they do that for a very specific person or purpose. They need to do something different in the workplace in order to do their job well, right? So I'm having trouble with my job, and so I need this to be qualified and to perform at the standards that my employer has. But there's a whole lot of people who don't need anything in the workplace, even though they might have a disability issue. And those people decide whether or not to identify as having a disability based on the culture of their workplace. Is it safe for me to tell my manager? Will anything negative happen to me if I tell my manager? And now we're adding the pandemic to the safety issue, right? So it's no longer just about culture. It's also about your health and your survival because of the severity that COVID-19 presents. So for a whole lot of people who have liver disease, who have blood disorders, who didn't have any physical symptoms that impacted their job, they will now be coming forward and asking for reasonable accommodations, whether it's access to a face shield or a private office or to limit exposure or to telework. You're going to have a lot more people coming forward because they now have a legitimate safety concern in the workplace that requires them to ask for reasonable accommodation. I think in some ways, for those employers who are federal contractors, this can actually be a good thing, because once someone discloses a disability at work, you can then count them in your self-identification numbers. So they will probably see an increase in the rates of people who are willing to self-identify. But it comes at a pretty steep cost. I think most federal contractors would rather not have a pandemic than increase their self-ID numbers this way.
So Eve, what kind of impact is this going to have on employers who hadn't anticipated this increased number of people asking for reasonable accommodation?
So I think learning about an employee's disability has two major impacts for employers. One is the obligation to engage in the accommodation analysis and to provide an accommodation if it's not an undue burden. And secondly, knowledge can be risk in terms of potential claims, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the first issue is once an employee discloses this to an employer that they have an issue, a disability, and a need for an accommodation, whether you're under the federal ADA or under state and local laws, the employer has an obligation to engage in a reasonable accommodation analysis. And that's that's a lot of work. It's not just yes or no to what the employee requests. If you can do that, that's great, but that's not the end of the analysis if the employee asks for something that the employer can't do. The employer is obligated to ask the employee, well, what else can happen? Here are some of the things that we can do. Hear back from the employee, perhaps get some input from the employee's doctor. Go back and forth to try to get to a place to give the employee some accommodation that they can do the job, do the essential functions of the job, even if it isn't the employee's first choice. If you can do the employee's first choice, great, but very important for the employer to run through the entire analysis and try to get an accommodation that allows the employee to do the job. Secondly, the information, once you know it, is risky, because sometimes when things don't work out in the workplace, employees may believe, whether rightly or wrongly, that the reason things didn't work out is because they've been disabled. And if they're disabled and the employer didn't know about it, that couldn't ever be the basis of a legitimate claim. But once the employer's on knowledge, then it becomes a fact question whether the employer considered an employee's disability and taking any adverse action. So there's risk there. And then I guess the last thing is, in terms of documenting that information, the employer must be very thoughtful and careful in keeping any disability-related information in a separate file, which can't be shared with those that don't have the need to know.
Thank you. Mark, I would like to go back to you for a moment and then ask questions that have been posed by people who are listening to us today. So you talked about the extra cleaning of restrooms. There'll be tents in front of buildings, and you talked about how expensive this is going to be. But Cushman & Wakefield is an international company. You have buildings all over the world. Can you give us insight into what lessons can be learned from what's happening in other countries? And you need to unmute yourself, please.
Our firm has a very large business in China. We manage hundreds of millions of square feet. And, I think we took a leadership position of all the major brokerage firms in all of this because we learned so much. And frankly, we learned it the hard way in China. And China has rental structures that are pretty much net structures where the tenants pay all of the additional costs associated with running a building. And there's great ownership among Chinese corporates of their buildings. So they have fewer problems than we do. And they tend to be much more pliable as a people, as citizens, with respect to rules and what they have to do. So they're 3 or 4 months ahead of us. And they seem to be doing a pretty good job. For example, there's these spots where you have to stand in an elevator. Everybody queues up in a pretty organized way. There is no stress. Everybody faces the wall, and they go about their business. The increased costs are passed through to the tenants from the landlords or from the owners, or in fact, even the tenants are the owners, and there's no questioning about that. This goes back to one of the comments I made very quickly, which is we're not getting very consistent information from Washington. And when I say that is the CDC has been giving some pretty consistent guidance, but different states are doing things differently. We have a president and a vice president who don't acknowledge what this might be or what this is. And so everybody's struggling to figure out what these protocols need to be, especially in office buildings. And I single out office buildings because there's lots of people getting together, and vertical transportation in the major cities is, a big issue. And it's very hard to standardize protocols the way the Chinese have when we can't even get our arms around an appropriate policy amongst ourselves.
Thank you. Well, now I'd like to turn to some of the questions that we have from our participants. And one question is, people understand what will happen when the employer takes my temperature. The question is, what happens if the employer hires an external company to take my temperature, or the building is taking my temperature? What happens to that medical information to keep that medical information safe? Eve, could you speak to that for a moment? And then Wendy, if you have anything to add.
Sure. Just this morning, I was working on a contract for a client that's a building owner and that is hiring a vendor to get this information. And we are requiring that that information be kept by the third party in a pass-fail manner, and to only inform us of a fail, so that we're not going to actually have any access to that type of information. I do think that that's important. I mentioned earlier, New York is actually forbidding employers from maintaining temperature information, and I think we should take steps not to have it more than we need it. Certainly if somebody failed, then the information would be relevant to make a business decision if it's COVID related or not, and to get some medical expertise.
Wendy, anything to add there?
The only thing I would add is there are some disabilities that can cause low-grade fever, autoimmune disorders, for example, that if someone fails, that the third-party vendor knows not to just summarily exit them from the building, but rather have a space where they can go and speak to a representative of their own company to see if a reasonable accommodation has been made or should be made before they're summarily dismissed from the workplace.
Okay, thank you. Back to this question of taking somebody's temperature. What are the requirements of taking somebody's temperature who is a visitor or an independent contractor, either to the building or by the employer? Can you do that? Can you take my temperature if I'm merely coming to visit somebody in the building? I may not even be a client. I'm just coming into the building. What's the responsibility there, and what happens with that data?
I'll start on that.
Steve, you want to start, and then Wendy?
Yeah, it's required in some jurisdictions, not required in other jurisdictions, and probably a best practice anywhere. Most of my landlord clients are taking temperature because it's no different if the employee has it or a vendor or somebody coming into the building comes into an office as it can spread amongst everybody. So yes, the building should be doing that. Best practice is recommended.
Anything to
Yeah, same caveat as before. For visitors, you're not going to have any kind of reasonable accommodation in place, but you still have the requirement to modify your policy and practices. So it can't just be I take your temperature and you're out. There has to be a discussion. And honestly, it's good policy to put your visitor process and what's going to happen when you get there and what's the process out there in an accessible manner so that everyone can see it. So if a visitor knows that they often run a fever, they can call ahead and say, listen, this is me. I'm coming to do this. I generally run a fever. Should I be coming in, or is there a different way that we can do this? If you're going to be screening me and I don't want to get into that whole mess, so that there can be options discussed before a person ever has to go into the building.
If I could just briefly add to that point, I talked about training earlier of the person that's doing the screening, whether that's an employee or it's an outside contractor. As part of that training, they should have a list of questions that and answers, frankly, that they can go through with an individual as temperature, because as Wendy says, there are going to be some accommodations that need to be made. Some of the companies are actually having medical support that can then speak with whether it's a tenant or an employee, whoever it is, to get that information to help make a medically based decision to rule out whether it's likely a COVID-19 related temperature.
So, Mark, is Cushman & Wakefield giving any specific advice to buildings about taking people's temperature, especially people who may not work in the building? Is there anything that you've advised your clients to do? You're muted.
There should be 100% temperature screening in every building of every employee and every contractor without fail every time access is given.
So Esther, one thing I wanted to add is that there was a research study released just in the past couple of days that was done in the UK. And so a group of doctors in the UK did this study and they found only 75% of people who have COVID-19 actually have a temperature. So it should not just be a temperature. If someone comes in with a cough and have you experienced any symptoms of COVID-19? Here's what those are. So those are also should be part of the screening. It can't be just temperature and done. Because there are 25% of the population who will have the virus and not have a temperature.
But Wendy, to that point, we're advising every property owner to have all the employees of the tenants have to do that self-certification about symptoms via an app, and every visitor has to, in writing, do the same thing when they check into the building. So, a system is only as good as its weakest link. And we're trying to communicate the absolute importance of creating no weak links. It's impossible, but you absolutely have to try. And sure, there's some potential liability associated with that, and Eve could probably speak, better to that than I could. But the choice is to be so afraid of the liability that you're allowing an unhealthy thing to, infect a building, and we consider that to be intolerable.
Yeah, I agree
So
with
wait,
that completely.
before you go ahead, Eve, I have to do a little bit of administrative work here. So I need to give everybody their CLE code. The CLE code is ILR 1970. The CLE code is ILR 1970, and the speakers do not have to know the code. You automatically will get your CLE. I'm sorry, Eve, please continue.
Oh, sure. So I was going to agree with Mark. The liability will come in when you don't do the things that you should be doing that are either required or best practices and recommended, because if you're doing a great job with your employees, but you're allowing people to come into the building without the same type of scans and they bring COVID-19 into the workplace, you really haven't done the right thing. And the other thing is that the more information, the better. So it's not just a temperature scan. It's all the questions that I mentioned earlier, whether it's in an app or whether it's taken down, and then all of it looked together. And yes, accommodations have to be made. You start with the position that you're not going to allow somebody in, but once they raise an accommodation, then the individual should be trained to go through the analysis and have somebody with the medical expertise available to consult promptly.
And just if I could throw in terms of the screenings, your app should be accessible. There should be alternatives to completing the form in writing, so that people who can't do those things without that can also do the form.
Okay, another question from a group of people. So this was one of the people, and I've seen this question several times and people keep asking it, so let's see if we can answer it again, which is, what if an employee does not have a disability, but they very legitimately do not feel safe coming into work? And the question is, the companion question to that, which I'm asking, is at what point do we say, well, you have to come into work? What's your recommendation, Eve, as a management lawyer, to your employers that you represent when the employee says, I'm afraid of, if this is New York City, so I'm afraid of riding on the New York City subway, I don't feel comfortable coming into work. How do you handle that situation?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on the level of fear. If it gets to the point where it's a mental disability, it might actually be a disability that we'd have to address. But let's assume, for the purposes of this discussion, Esther, that it's not, and it's just a general fear. I'm working with clients to try to allow individuals to work from home or to do their work if they can. But if it gets to the point where they can't, or it's the type of job where camaraderie or supervision or what have you is necessary, the legal answer is they can be required to come into work and could potentially lose their job if they don't do that. But, this is like something we've never seen before. We don't want to lose good employees, and we all have fears from these things. And I think it behooves employers to try to do as much as they can, if reasonable, to work with the employees on these issues.
Good. Okay, based on the CDC and public health authorities as of March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic meets the direct threat standard. Does the CDC have the authority to tell the courts that that's the standard that will have to be met in employment cases? That's a great question.
EEOC doesn't think so, because they have, even though they have regulations, which before COVID-19 we were looking at about flu pandemics and what would, in certain circumstances, it could be considered a direct threat. They did not go so far in the EEOC's Q&A on COVID-19, and that's why I went through that discussion earlier. They're not going to assume it. They're still requiring medical evidence as to whether it's a direct threat to any particular individual. And Esther, I believe you posted the EEOC's Q&A guidance that employers can look at for more information on that.
Okay,
And
next,
can I just add that's about assumptions, right? Because you have asthma, so I'm deciding that it's not safe for you. There has to be a standard of proof that's required. So it can't just be, I think you're a direct threat and I'm not letting you in. There has to be a standard to protect the employees who have disabilities. And I don't think that's a bad thing. So do your due diligence. That's the bottom line, right?
yes. Okay, so next question. and I think this is probably Wendy and Eve again. What is the recommended process if a person has a pre-existing condition that presents some of the symptoms of COVID? For example, a person says, yes, they have diarrhea on a health screen, but the person then says, but I have IBS, and I usually have diarrhea. Or a person has a runny nose, and they have chronic seasonal allergies. That's normal for them. Should they be sent home, paid, and then asked to provide medical substantiation? How do we deal with that? And that can be dealt with at the entrance to the building, Mark, or it could be handled at the employer's site. What do we do about that kind of double-edged situation?
So there's very limited amounts of efficacious screening that can be done as people enter a building. If you remember after September 11th, Esther, the porters and the lobby attendants were overwhelmed learning how to do security screenings. They're probably in over their heads, especially in the smaller buildings with temperature screenings. And there's no way that building personnel on any level are going to be qualified to interact with tenants who might have any kind of medical issue. That's got to be all on the employer. And frankly, the burden isn't so much in the big buildings because there's big companies, but it's in the 180,000 square foot building that, there's lots of 1 and 2 floor tenants or even multi-tenant floors where there's small companies where it's going to be really, really tricky. And nobody's really thought through an answer to that question.
Eve? Wendy, go ahead.
I recommend the word new. Have you had any new coughs? Have you had any new bowel or bladder issues, new loss of sense of smell? Because if it's existing, then it doesn't matter. I have an autoimmune condition, so I always have some things. And so the word new in there is a really critical disclaimer.
I think this is really a great question, and I agree with Mark. I don't think everybody's thought through it, but I bet after we live with this, after a period of time, people that have these conditions are going to be working around with the doctor's note that specifies that, because, what is a building or an employer to do the first time up? Do we trust an employee that says, oh no, it's this, that, or the other thing? Or do we require some medical proof like we ordinarily would when we get into an accommodation situation? So I think early on, if we could have somebody available who can maybe ask medical questions, that might help. But ultimately, I think there's going to be people that have disabilities are probably going to take some proactive steps so that when they're confronted with this situation, they'll have what they need to get them through quicker.
Another question about masks. So what about people who feel they need an accommodation about wearing a mask because as they wear that mask and it causes them anxiety, and ultimately we're talking about the possibility of a mental disability. How do you determine that? How do you handle that request for accommodation? Either Eve or Wendy, who wants to start?
I'll start, Esther. Some of the legislation I read for Connecticut is one that comes to mind right in the statute, or I should say the executive order. It says that if somebody can't wear a mask because they have a disability, they don't have to. Others aren't as clear, but it's the same type of analysis. If they can't wear a mask, can we do something else to accommodate them but still keep folks safe? One thing that I've worked on with a particular company, somebody could not wear a mask, not for a mental disability, but because of asthma, and they couldn't breathe. And that person was segregated, to an area where they really would have little contact with other people. That's what they wanted, and they don't have to wear the mask. And other times when the employee is walking through the office, a face shield has been provided because it allowed them to breathe. So I think you have to be a little bit creative and try to think through ways that can keep people safe, but still allow the person that is unable to wear the mask to be at work.
Anything to add, Wendy?
No, that's pretty much it. Looking at if there are people who need an expedited entry, for example, someone who is autistic is not going to do great at waiting in lines. at the new change in process of getting into a building. There may need to make expedited entry for a few people, and the company should be handling that and notifying the building of how they plan to have that happen.
Mark, going back to the building and what's happening in the lobby. So an employee is coming into the building and has a temperature. The person has a cough. There's some concern about letting them go into the elevator and upstairs. What are you telling landlords in terms of speaking to the employer about what's happening in the lobby so that there's some communication? I assume that the building is not going to say to me, because I have a temperature of 100.5, go home. What happens and what communication needs to be set up between the building and the employer?
It's intense communication that there's got to be a team of people within each company that's responsible for fielding calls from the lobby that you have an employee we do not want to let in the building. And the go home directive has got to come from the company. It can't come from building personnel because it just would be too inflammatory. And, you know, if you want to have a doctor in a lab coat doing it, maybe they have the authority, or an ex-cop who's trained in de-escalation, maybe they can do it. But there's going to be a lot of emotion, because think about the emotion. You're not feeling so well. You're a little bit barky, but you're not sure. You go into the train, into the subway. You stress about getting to work, and then you're told you can't go in. There's going to be lots of blowouts, and the companies have got to be involved in that.
We're running out of time, but quickly, Eve, is there anything you want to add in terms of what you're telling your clients?
Boy, that's such a broad question. I think that they should be flexible, if I'm going to sum up with one word. This is like something we've never seen before. We have to think a little bit out of the box, and we should try to do more to work with employees where we can. I would be cautious. I would follow the guidelines. I'm much more concerned about somebody bringing a claim because the employer did not comply with PPE or administrative fixes than somebody who claims that they've gotten personal information.
Okay, well, we're actually just about running out of time. I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. I also want to thank you, Eve, Mark, and Wendy. I think we could go on for another hour. There's a list of questions in the chat box, and there's also lots of questions that I have. So I want to thank you very much for your candor and for your willingness to participate today and give us such good guidance. Again, in the chat box, there should be the URL for the evaluation and for the materials. If you're having trouble finding the materials, then please go to the website. If you go to the ILR School's website and you go under public engagement and you look at labor and employment law, you will find our website for all the materials. And in addition, we are actually recording this, so this will be available on our website as well. Again, I want to thank you all very much for participating. I've learned a lot, and now I have a lot more questions, and I may just have to do another program. Thank you all very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.